My name is Deryl, and I'm from Nebraska, and I went to school in Chicago to Northwestern University, and I got a degree in performance studies. And at the time, I was studying a lot of solo performance stuff, but I really didn't get into storytelling. So I want to tell you, as we start, a little bit about how I got into this, because it relates to the Lehigh Valley Storytelling Guild. My office mate in 1995, my second year at Kutztown, was Laura Facciaponti. And Laura and her sister Lisa were members here. And in fact, Laura would tell me all about storytelling. And the next thing I knew, Laura got a job and went up to East Stroudsburg, and then even started introducing me to drumming and other things. And she was working on Lenape Tales at the time. And I got a job in West Virginia because we were both only temporary at Kutztown. Kutztown hired me back in about 1998, and I have been on the tenure track, and then I got tenure, and I'm a professor, and next year I will be chairperson of our Department of Communication starting actually in May, and we are the largest major currently at Kutztown University, Communication Studies. And one of the fundamental courses that I teach and I have taught, since I have some students here, so I'm afraid I've already told them how old I am, in a way, but I've been teaching storytelling. I think my first section was a special topics in 1998. So next year will be 20 years of teaching storytelling. Well, so I shared an office with Laura, and she was always telling me about this thing, and I thought, well, I do solo performance, and I do cabaret work, and I do a lot of performance of literature. At the time at Kutztown, I taught oral interpretation of literature, later performance of literature, and it was the oral communication requirement that Kutztown used for accreditation for anyone being a teacher in elementary or secondary ed, especially in English. They had to pass that course. And I got a call from a friend who said, storytelling is really starting to take off in the country. You should think about a storytelling class. And I thought, well, I don't know if I know enough. Well, by that time, Laura got a job down at the University of North Carolina at Asheville, just a few miles from Jonesboro, so she invited me down, so I got to see the storytellers. I started on a tenure track a few years later, and I proposed that we did a project with all the people that were hired in my year, and we decided, I invented this thing called Performing Diversity, and it would be every 2 years, and this 3-day celebration where we would have, I think at top we had 100 different sessions on diversity. By the third one in 2001, after I had visited Laura, I thought we should have one group that sort of is the main performance, but also filters through a lot of the colleges and the events. And I decided to bring in storytellers. And that year, I brought in Bobby Nofolk, brought in Antonio Sacri, who has been with us at least 3 times, the lovely and just the wonderful Elizabeth Ellis, who took off her shoes and sat barefoot on the floor to tell that we loved. We had Dovey Thomason, and we had Jay O'Callahan. And Jay had done, for then the second time, it had been a year since he had premiered Pouring the Sun, his big opus about Bethlehem Steel. Now he has the other ones about NASA and some other ones. But the family from Bethlehem came up to Kutztown. It was the first year of our new president that year, and everyone said storytelling. In the past, storytelling was taught occasionally, but most of the people had retired that were doing it in library science. And Donald Davis had been on our campus a couple of times before I got there. So I thought, well, maybe I'll do storytelling. And in those first years, I basically spoon-fed the students. I would give them basically ready to tell tales by your favorite storyteller, so that they could not only pick the story, but they could also even look sort of on paper at a performance, because it's before the internet for those out there watching on internet. There wasn't a way for them to see them. And we would get recordings by our storytellers in those days on cassettes. the storytellers, that's a lot of times how they would make their money. In those days, though, still the top tellers were hard to book. I remember trying to get a couple of Latina tellers, and they were being booked 2 years out. And that's still true today. Schools and stuff were very anxious, especially in college, in trying to use storytelling to talk about diversity. So at first, that's what I did. And when I sort of organized my basic course, I always have the first assignment. Usually I have them repeat it. Have a couple students in the back, and they'll tell you they do a cultural story, because cultural stories were the easiest way to start talking about how to perform a different culture and maybe have a glimpse in your own culture. So we always have that as part of our basic course. The second thing we always had is personal stories, which you're having now in this area. The Red Stag, I think, is where it is. We call them personal narratives in higher education, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. And then the third and final assignment is oral history. And that's sort of where I came really known, I guess, if I'm known a little bit in the area, is that I went up to the town of Centralia because there was a poet on our campus that had written a poem about this town that was on fire. And that it had been on fire since 1962, and I didn't understand why people were still there. So I went up every weekend for 3 days and collected the stories. And then after the stories, I decided, how am I going to give them back? And it ended up being a play. There was also a book and some documentaries. I ended up doing 150 interviews. And here's where one of the first lessons were. I went up because I had a question I wanted to answer, and then the storytellers would tell me another story and another story. And at the time in Centralia, there were only 10 buildings left and about 20 people, but they could see the town. By the end of the 18 months when I was going up to collect these stories in Centralia, I could see the buildings that were there because of their stories. And when I would take people, one time I took the CBS early morning show, the national show, came in and they wanted me to do tours, but they kept saying, well, this is not the fact. And I said, well, this is their story. Well, stories need to be about facts. I said, stories have their own truth, and we're going to come back to that notion in just a minute. But, so I've always loved oral history, and at the end of tonight's, we're going to have question and answer, but at the end I'll give you just a little bit of my most recent collection of an oral history and how the students will be using it in the next couple of weeks in our class, because it's their final assignment. So at Kutztown, we value storytelling, and it's used across the curriculum. More and more we're finding that in higher education, everybody wants to do it. After Laura and I connected and I started teaching it, we offered a short course for our national discipline, the communication discipline, and we invited the great, because I had met her at other conventions, the great Penina Schramm, the great Jewish teller, lots of books, lots of resources, and also performs with a musician, oftentimes beautiful teller. And we all did a 3-hour workshop at a national convention. Then we got invited to the first International Storytelling Conference, and from that came an organization that I'm still on the editorial board and friends with the co-editors of the International Journal for Storytelling. It's called Storytelling, Self, and Society. And all of you watching or here can publish. You don't have to be in higher education. They're always looking for people talking about what they're doing. It doesn't have to be what we think of as a scholarly article. There are scholarly articles, but there are many kinds of articles in here. Well, the guy that I went to college with at Northwestern ended up being the co-editor. His name is Joseph Sobel. Some of you might have seen him or read articles by him. And Joseph is lucky enough, he teaches the master's program in storytelling at Eastern Tennessee and owns a house on the top of the hill in Jonesboro. So what a life. He gets to be in the center, the cradle of the revival of storytelling. And we had a professor that had a book in storytelling, but it was always tough for me to find the books. And still today, sometimes it's very hard to find one university textbook. So what do we go to? We go to the books that all the storytellers use. And the one that my professor had written at Northwestern was The Power of Story. This was Pam Cooper and Reeves Collins. He was head of theater. But the ones that I use more than any others right now, Doug Lippman, Improving Your Storytelling, and the Storyteller Startup Book by Margaret Reed McDonald. So at the end, you can always email me at johnson@kutztown.edu, and I'll give you a link to all the resources. But always remember, the best publisher, if you haven't started buying books on storytelling, the best place, and I get no money for this, is go to August House. August House is the first place because they have so many titles and they really care deeply about storytelling and the storytellers. But I said I want to talk about this truth thing. Why is storytelling about truth? That was a very hard thing, and I'm going to go back to this notion of personal stories. In higher education, we call it narrative, okay? So personal narrative was very big. About 1984, there was a very important scholar, he's since retired, at the University of Southern California named Walter Fisher. And for 2,000 years, since Aristotle, who wrote the book The Rhetoric, which is the foundation for public speaking, for communication people, everything was about logic. Everything was about reasoning. And yet more and more people were saying stories. Aristotle said, anecdotes, testimony, that's bad. Fisher said, you know what, there's a power to story, and maybe we should rethink the power of story. But he had a lot of opposition. If there's one thing higher education can do, we like to fight amongst ourselves. You know, you have it over here, you have it over here. Even though we would say we want to be interdisciplinary, we're going to fight. So people said, well, it's not about truth. Now, I told you I took those tours of people from CBS News. They were journalists. They wanted the truth. And I kept saying, listen to the story. The truth is in the story. Well, that's not the truth. I'm seeking the answer to my question. When I first went to Centralia, that's what I did. I tried to seek an answer. And the whole time people were answering because they were telling me that's their stories. And the line that I use, it's not mine, I credit Donald Davis, is that stories are the surest way home. Stories are the surest way home. And every time we collect an oral history from somebody else, as I did in Centralia for all those 18 months and all the other times, we were home. We could see the buildings. They were telling us why they didn't want to leave, because it was home. This was before Katrina and some other disasters, and we don't question now when people rebuild after a mudslide or something. But we thought the Centralians shouldn't stay there. That was home. They said, well, I don't know why they stayed, because a lot of times they didn't have family. Their neighbors, as one of the storytellers in Centralia told me, my neighbors are my family. That was the truth they kept trying to see. Didn't fit sometimes with what a journalist said. So personal narrative. So we go back to Walter Fisher. And he said, I'm going to give you this narrative theory, but actually I think it's bigger than a theory. Bigger than a theory is a paradigm. It means it's a whole world view. And to sum it up, he said he believes that all human communication boils down to this. We are storytelling animals. You can understand all of how communication works by that simple phrase. We are storytelling animals. We know that we work in groups if we go to sociology, but what he was trying to say is maybe we should look at every interaction. And since that time, now we look at it in organizational communication and in business for organizations. What's the brand? What is your story that you are telling? In family relationships, whether it be in counseling or it be in family communication or sociology, it's what's the family story about? And now, a lot of the large humanity grants across the country are saying, if you want money to develop things in the community, which our students are studying to make a difference in communities, They said, start with their stories, collect their stories, and then look in the stories for those clues of who feels what and how do they feel about things. And the way you can do is maybe you only have 2 people that are Portuguese in your town, but you can collect then those Portuguese stories and they can be valued. So personal narrative is huge right now in organizations. I was telling our host Charles here that I asked a colleague who came up to me at the beginning of the school year in the fall, and she said, Daryl, I can't wait to tell you that the latest edition of my textbook that I use now in the 4th edition of training people to be corporate trainers, whether it be any kind of training, oftentimes it might be about sexual harassment issues or retraining people to use new systems. But in communication, you want someone that's learning corporate communication. There's now a chapter in storytelling. I want to read you the last page of the chapter in storytelling. Because we're on tape, I'm not going to give the name of the book, but I have not copied more than 10%. When you hear the 4 simple rules that they're teaching college students to go out and be the corporate trainers for the next generation, this book was published in 2016. You're going to say, wait a minute, that's what I do, because I've heard you tell. Laura brought me here to the Guild. We saw Bill Lepp and other people. So again, for the last 20 years that I've been teaching a course, I've also been an audience member. And I thank Charles and everybody else, because I got a chance to see some of the best tellers. And I'm talking about the local tellers as well as the national tellers when I've seen your work here. But and I know you do this work, here's the 4 things. They said if you want to learn to tell a story, to be a good trainer, you need to create a transition from the main content that you're doing to your story. Okay, so we need to do a transition. The second thing you need to do is be dramatic. And basically what they're saying is be expressive. Third, be descriptive. Okay, let the audience see the images. And finally, stick to the story. Remember, the story itself has value. So, create a transition, be dramatic, be descriptive, stick to the story. I think I should be giving you, since you're doing it already, 3 college credit for the training course, because here's a chapter, and that's what we do every day, I think, as storytellers. But let's get back a little bit to this narrative. Now, Fisher, and again, I like to teach as a story, that Fisher met with some opposition because they said, wait a minute, it's not about truth. So he said, okay, I'm going to create 2 tests that make it more likely to be true. So this is what we hear in colleges a lot, the 2 tests for a story. And that is the tests of, since the argument was they weren't rational, they weren't in the logic side when we get into story, he said, okay, I'll call it narrative rationality. And the 2 tests are coherence and fidelity. And coherence simply means, doesn't seem like a good story. Are there any holes in the story itself? Okay? And fidelity means, does it fit with my worldview? Does it seem like this is too far-fetched a story? So I guess Bill Lepp and his tall tale, we probably can't use him for fidelity. But of course, Fisher starts writing this in 84. By 95, roughly 20 years later, one of the biggest stories about coherence was the O.J. Simpson trial, which we talk about in our classes. Because for some people watching on television, it was that famous line, if it doesn't fit, you must acquit, because it ruined the story. If there was a bloody glove, if the glove had the DNA on the blood from the victims, if the glove didn't fit O.J. Simpson, it put a hole. People couldn't figure out why people cheered when he wasn't found guilty in that first trial. But Fisher and other scholars of narrative would say, well, they punched a big hole in the story. So lawyers now use narrative rationality as a means in the courtroom to try to get stories. Everyone in higher education is using this. The term we use, the best term we would probably say is teaching. We want to know what the method of teaching is, and we use story to teach. The word we use in higher education is pedagogy. It means, how do you teach? What's the method of teaching? And we teach every day with story. So whether it's a story of little Gecko who was too small to help when there was a drought in Africa, and so elephant goes, elephant, elephant, water, 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 and he can't dig and gives up. Or whether or not it's rhino, rhino, dig, dig, dig. And there's no water. And Gecko says, can I try it? Originally the story was Chameleon, but Margaret Reed McDonald, who has it in her book, says, I named him Gecko because that's what the kids see on TV. And so little Gecko goes, Gecko, Gecko, water, 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 Gecko, Gecko, water, 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 but doesn't give up. And of course, we know the end of that story, that we get water. And the great thing about these stories is we can adapt them. We can work. We can play with them. So we're teaching this with our students today. We're trying to get them to understand that these stories can be a vehicle to teach something else. So if it's storytelling, it's pedagogy, then you can use the Gecko story if I'm teaching teachers on how to get the kids active. So then all the kids can do the elephant, or maybe learning about different animals. Or you can use the Gecko story to teach about a drought to little kids. So pedagogy, so we teach our students, especially in education, use storytelling as the vehicle to do something else. Kutztown does it too. It's very hard to get students to take an elective in mathematics. We can ask our two students back there. So now some people love math. I don't mean to discourage, but there are some people that won't take a math class. So we use story as a way to get people interested in a topic. And one of the most popular math courses at Kutztown University is Women in Mathematics, where we learn the stories of important women mathematicians. And then the students get excited about the math that they're doing. Now, Kutztown's been teaching this for a while, and yet we just saw this year an Academy Award-winning movie, about the women and the math and our first moon launch with John Glenn. And so this idea of using story to get people interested has always been with us. So we've talked a little bit, I'm conscious of the time because we will have time for question and answers, but we've talked a little bit about my basic course, which is basically cultural stories to really help get into the diversity angle. We've talked about understanding the concept of narrative, and especially in personal stories. We've talked about oral history. I want to talk a little bit about, because of the digital age, the other thing we're really noticing in higher ed is that more and more people are afraid to stand up in front of other people and tell stories. We communicate like this. So no matter what your discipline is at the university, we can't get a student to stand still, let alone engage someone. And I like the phrase human contact, not eye contact, because you're giving the gift of a story to other people. You're not just kind of looking at them. So it's got to be a human interaction. But we can get them, but usually I tell them, videotape yourself, because they're all about videotaping themselves. For a lot of years, I could never have a video camera. They would be incensed. Now they expect it, or they'll bring their own, as they're telling. But I would say, turn the sound off. Watch your body as you do that. So what I'd like to do now, and I think one of my specialties too in higher ed, is how do you deal with the performance itself? So I'm going to start with a little bit of theory, just a tiny little bit of theory, and then we'll also do a participation exercise. One of the great performance scholars, and we borrow this for storytelling and other types of performance, is looking at the performance cycle. And in my storytelling class, I break it down like this. You can look at it as a wheel, as a cycle ongoing, or a journey, depending upon the metaphor you want to do, whether it's the proto-performance, that area, and then that goo that we work in before we perform the performance, and then they use the word aftermath, which I think is kind of problematic. But I like the idea that you collect the story, whether it's your personal story, someone else's story if it's oral history, or a cultural story, a fairy tale, a folk tale, the legend. Then the most important word, play. Play. Don't rehearse, play with it. Do stuff. Do the opposite of what you think it's going to be. Play, play, play. Then after you've played with the story a lot, then rehearse what you might do. Then you get to the performance. And I'll do a shout out to my students. What happens after performance? What happens immediately after the performance? Shout it out.
Cool down.
Yeah.
The cool down, which is what the students never understand. They're so nervous that they run off the stage. They don't know, and we'll talk about nervousness in a second. But immediately after the performance is the cool down. And the hardest thing I get is stay there and let the audience thank you, because they're here. And cool down is not the time to get critiques. Now, even you observe this. When I look at you, when I look at what your format is, it's so perfect in the performance cycle. After the 7:30 performances, you break. You get up, you walk, you get coffee, you get tea, you use the facilities, or you just thank each other before then, and people select whether or not they're ready to have some feedback. That cool down is so important and part of performance theory, that we never immediately go, oh, you should have done this, you should have done this, that we cool down first. Then, after we cool down, then we can have analysis, critique. Then, an important thing is archiving. How are you going to remember what happened? Are you going to write it down? Is it going to go to memory? Is it going to be videotape? And then the next time you pull it out, then instead of creation, it's reintegration. And so that cycle goes all the way around. Well, that cycle is a lot like nervousness. We have pre-performance anxiety, we have performance anxiety, and we have post-performance anxiety, and many of us have all three. We dread what we're going to do, we're nervous when we do it, and then we wonder how we did afterwards. So there are different strategies for each one, but again, rehearsal, breathing, some of the most important, and also remembering that cool down. For the after performance, that's maybe the one people don't usually realize. You're not ready to take a criticism usually immediately after a performance. So don't say, how'd I do? Because you really don't want to know. What you want people to say is, you did great. You're normal. You're fantastic. Nobody wants to hear, didn't quite make it. And remember, you're not from the audience. I always tell my students, you have rehearsed it so many times, it's fresh for us. Please don't assume you know how the performance went. So the performance cycle, so that's really a standard class that I've been teaching for 17 years. We focus on three kinds. We watch a lot of tellers. We learn about the genres of storytelling, whether it's a folk tale, a fable. We will look at also larger genres such as cultural tales. We'll look at personal narrative. We'll look at oral histories. And what I found is the course usually has been it's been the most popular course in our department until recently. And I think the reason it still always fills by the second day of registration. It used to fill within the first half day of registration. That's why I can say it was popular. It used to always be the first one in our department. And I think one of the reasons it takes a little bit more is because there's more anxiety now. I have to get up and tell a story. But my students will tell you the way that I coach the body these days is you never give them technique. And I think it was Sid Lieberman in The Call of Story, a great video. The Call of Story said, storytelling is not about technique, it's about being fully human. It's about being fully human. And so the more I can get the students to understand their connection with the story and understand the story and then giving it as a gift to others, once they do that, their body tells them what to do in the telling. If they don't quite understand the story, or they're not rehearsed or whatever. It's all of this stuff. But once they want to tell, and I have some students here today, but what happens is the magic moment really happens in the last 2 weeks of class. They struggle a little bit with cultural stories, especially if they do a different culture. Then they do a personal narrative, feel a little better, and then they start collecting their grandmother's stories or their friends' stories. And by the end of the class, they say, well, it isn't you, Dr. Johnson, and it never is me, but they say, it's the closest group we've ever had. And I have groups of storytelling students. They're only there because it used to be required, it's not. And again, we didn't have to make it required because everyone takes it. But they have lasting friendships. So I want to tell you just a couple of the stories that have popped up. I can't do justice to the story, so I'm just going to tell you some of the themes. Just last semester, actually a year ago spring, I had a young man who in the personal narrative, and we talk a lot about what's safe in a personal narrative, especially on a college campus. What can you talk about? And he shared that when he was 11 or 12, he found out his father was alive. He was told his father died. His father had been incarcerated since he was a young kid. And his mother decided to tell him that the father had passed away. You can imagine how impactful that story was for us that he shared. And then in the oral history round, he called his father in the prison. Didn't talk to him too much, but decided he wanted to get a story from his biological father. And his father told him he was around for the first year, and the song he used to sing to him when he held him in his arms. And the student then sang some of the song, which even though he was a year, and for most of the first 10 and 11 years, thought his father wasn't in the picture, he remembered that song. Our students, and what Fisher said is always right, human beings are storytellers. It's great you can study stuff, but these personal stories that people tell. I remember another student who was talking about it, and I had a couple of different versions. One time it was outside in a church step, and one time it was sitting in a barber chair. Both were students that lived in inner city Philadelphia, and in one case, very similar stories, but very different. I love what Rex Ellis always says, my story's not your story, but I bet you see yourself in it. And remember, Rex Ellis is like the head of the exhibits for the Smithsonian, this storytelling, what you can do with storytelling. I always tell my students, what kind of job can you get after college? But the student, both of them were sitting, two different students, 10 years apart, and the student in the barber chair or the student sitting on the steps of the church with their friends, both, someone comes in, shoots the person next to them. And one of the reasons they were telling the story of why I selected Kutztown University. Because my mom wanted to make sure I was safe. There's no better story or campaign. We're going through a new campaign to talk about Kutztown. We talk about it now as if we're golden. But those stories, there's no more impactful story of what Kutztown might be able to do is to give people a chance and to help people be safe and to potentially be everything that they can be than those stories. So it's the easiest class to teach because I love going to it every day and I get paid to listen to these kind of stories. This young lady, last semester, little tiny thing, she's talking about, we think about Kutztown in sports a little bit, but she just happens to mention in the personal narrative round that she's been to 3 Olympics. 3 Olympics. If it wasn't for the personal narrative, she never felt comfortable sharing that story because it would be bragging, but in storytelling, getting to know. And she wanted to talk about what it was like to go to Japan She couldn't go to this last one because she has an injury, but she hopes to go. She's in, for those trying to figure it out, she's in Taekwondo. And so it's based on age and weight and gender and other things. But she's been, and she's not even 21, she's been to 3 Olympics.
Wow.
And she didn't get to go to this one and might get to go to the next one. She hopes to go to the next one. Now we get to find these hidden gems. And again, what students started figuring out too, that if I tell a story, it's not so bad. I'm not as scared as my other public speeches, whether it be in a public speaking class or in my sociology class, or if I have to talk about history, which, and I'm nervous that there's not enough facts. We say we'll start with the story. In fact, most public speaking books now say, maybe the first assignment, which is what I do in my public speaking class, start by a story, because all of a sudden we know how to tell stories. We've been telling stories our whole lives, and so the number one fear of Americans before death is public speaking. But they've been storytellers their whole lives, so if I ask them to tell a story for the first one, maybe about an animal or something, they can get up in front of it, and the first thing you know, they finished the first round and they didn't faint. They didn't have a panic attack. And so more and more textbooks use storytelling as pedagogy, as the first way to get over anxiety and all of these things. So before we get to, I want to do just 2 more quick things. One, a quick warm-up exercise with you all. And again, I want to pay honor to 2 people with the end of this talk tonight, before we get to questions. One is to the Guild itself, but that's coming. And right now the exercise is dedicated to Laura Faccipanti, who taught me this. And I always give her credit, and I've done it at many national conventions, and people ask me to do it all the time. It's a bigger theater game, but what you will learn with this game, that by the second time you play it, by the third time you play it, you beat me. You win all the time. But what you really win after doing this game is you learn how to relax, you learn how to breathe, and you learn how to maybe listen a little bit better. So would you like to do a quick game? You can do it from your seats. Would you like to do an exercise together where you learn to breathe, relax? That's the key to it. Listen and breathe. All you have to say, they know, they're smiling back there. Why don't you 2 come up and help me? Or at least stand up. Okay, so all you have to say is the word bop. Everyone can say the word bop. Would you say bop?
Bop.
Okay. I'm going to say the phrase boppity bop bop bop. Okay? I'm going to say, you don't have to say that. All you have to say is bop. I'm going to say boppity bop bop bop. You have to say bop before I finish. Okay? Boppity bop bop bop. Boppity bop bop bop. Boppity bop bop bop. Bop. Oh, but if I only say bop, or if I say bop bop bop, you say nothing.
Oh, you didn't say that.
No, I'm telling you now. We haven't started yet. So, you have to breathe. The first time it's so mad, and it's like, bop! It's like they're in the military and good. Actually, the military students always do really well, because the pops are, it's always really, really quiet. Breathe and just listen. And if you can get rid of that relaxation. See, they're standing, they know. And within the second time, old Doc Johnson's can't get people to lose, because if they say, I make them stand, and if they do it wrong, then they have to sit down. There's always people still standing. I can't win by the third, because then they learn, okay, I just have to listen and breathe. So we'll do a couple of group ones, and then I'll show you what I do with the students. Boppity bop bop bop. Boppity bop bop bop. Boppity bop bop bop. Bop. Pop, bitty, pop, pop, pop. Oh, that was late. See, I'm a tricky guy. They'll tell you I'm a tricky guy. Poppity, pop, pop, pop. Poppity, pop, pop, pop. Pop. Oh, no, it's not pop. And I always have to caution them, because the internet, no nasty words after, no pop. Just be careful about that afterwards. Especially in college, I have to say that that's not the name of the game. Poppity, pop, pop, pop. Poppity, pop, pop, pop. 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 And to help the students, we put them in a line, and then I point to them so that they know it's their turn. None of this boppity bop bop bop. No. I'm gonna look at you the whole time, and I'm gonna say boppity bop bop bop. Good, exactly how to do it. And I'll go around the room, and sometimes it's a matter of just taking one step closer to the students, because it's that distance thing. And then we can talk about how close are you going to be to the audience when you tell. So we're going to play boppity bop bop bop. Will you two at least come up here? You don't have to be on camera. And I'm not going to pick on you, but I'm going to show you how we do it. But within 5 minutes, you can teach this game. I do it at national conferences and stuff. And people go, oh, I can use that. Oh, you can do it right there. Okay, so two of my students, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to look at them, and I'm going to say, boppity bop bop bop. See, already he lost. I pointed at him, and he didn't do it. For those on the camera, you can't see the student, but he didn't respond. You can hear it. Boppity bop 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 bop. Now, when I'm pointing to him, remember, okay. Boppity bop 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 bop. Boppity bop 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 bop. Boppity bop bop bop. That was late. Boppity bop 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 bop. Boppity bop 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 bop. Boppity bop 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 bop. Boppity bop bop bop. Okay, relax. Remember, you can see you're getting tension, so thank you very much. Thank you very much. You can see the tension in their body, and we'll keep saying, relax the hands and do that. So that was the exercise I wanted to do. I'm conscious that it's 5 to 7. So I want to give you just a little bit of the oral history I collected last Memorial Day, since we're it's April already. It's almost April 15th. So I go back to see my mom. And my family, everybody is from Nebraska. And my mom said, please come to church. It's Memorial Day. It's a little town. I go to her church with her. I'm sitting in the back pew, and this little diminutive man gets up, and he's in uniform. His name is Roger Peters. And later, I collected this story from him. He gave me permission to share it with audiences. And Roger was still wearing his World War II uniform. It still fit. 1945. Almost 70 years ago now. And this is the very end of an hour's worth of stories, and it's just one little moment at the end, even of what I do, but just to give you a taste. So what had happened earlier in the story is that Roger still rides a bicycle. He's 94 years old, and he still rides a bicycle through our little town. But he's always loved motorcycles. And sometimes he would have a sidecar in the 40s and other things, but he had this motorcycle that he was right after the German surrender. And he was in France, and in the sort of villa that the troops were staying in out in the back barn, there was a motor scooter, and he got it to working and thought he would go out. So he goes out after working on this long bridge, and everybody is waiting for the bridge to be reconstructed so they can get back to Germany and get back home. He's out late one night. And so you got to picture Roger, still at attention. He loves to tell stories. He's up in our church, and the bike breaks down. He's afraid he's going to be AWOL because he can't get back. And this was a joyride, and he doesn't know, and he really needs a push. He thinks if he just can push the bicycle or the motorbike, but he can't push it and be on it at the same time for it to get a start. In the distance, he sees a figure walking towards him. And as the man comes closer, Roger says, you could see his clothes were dirty from living in them. Not for a day, not for a week, but for months. And pretty soon you could see he had been in a concentration camp. Roger needed this push. So he looked at the guy and he said, he wanted to ask him to push, but the prisoner spoke German and Roger only spoke English. Somehow they communicated that he needed a push, and the prisoner, who was disheveled and so underweight, pushed him. Roger takes off on the motor scooter, and I'll now go to the part and try to suggest a little bit of what Roger told me. So I go I go down the road just a little bit and I turn around and I come back. And he's smiling. Almost 70 years later, I still remember that smile. I have never seen that smile like that man. And he had tears in his eyes with the smile, and he had helped me so I could get back. And I think about that smile, and I think it was gratitude. Gratitude. Because we had helped him get out of the concentration camp, and he wanted to help one other soldier. Gratitude. I am so grateful for his push, but for his smile for the last 70 years. And as I stand here on Memorial Day, I wish you that joy, that smile, as you remember all those who have helped you.